Hi, and welcome to this evening's discussion, Locked Down, Canada's Failed COVID-19 Response. This event is co-hosted by True North and by Civitas Canada. For anyone interested in finding out more about True North, please visit our website at tnc.news, and please consider making a tax-deductible donation to support independent, fact-based journalism in Canada. We have a lot of exciting projects going on over at True North, including a forthcoming mini documentary on Justin Trudeau's war against legal gun owners in Canada, which is written and hosted by my colleague, Andrew Lawton. And for anyone interested in more information about Civitas Canada, please visit our website at civitascanada.ca, where you can find out more information about joining the organization. Okay, that's it for the housekeeping program. So let's go to tonight's show. It has been over a year now since the Wuhan novel coronavirus began to wreak havoc on our society. 1 year ago, we were introduced to a bevy of new catchphrases and euphemisms that are now heard almost daily. Shelter in place, social distancing, mask mandates, lockdowns, quarantines, vaccines, herd immunity, flatten the curve, and the new normal. These were things that we barely ever heard before, and now we hear them every day. Remember, a year ago, we were told that we were staying at home for a few weeks to help flatten the curve. Well, those 2 weeks have turned into 52 weeks and counting, and in that time, we have witnessed a remarkable transformation of our society. In January 2020, no one would have believed you if you had said that the government would be confining people in their homes, that they would be forcing businesses to shut down, causing record unemployment, tanking the economy, and racking up hundreds of billions of dollars in new debt. No one would believe that the Trudeau government would be the ones closing the borders, shutting down the border with our biggest trading partner, and banning flights to warm locations during a bitter cold winter. No one would think that government busybodies would be issuing fines to children playing in parks, to adults exercising outside, or that Canadians would be detained and held against their will without access to a lawyer for the crime of coming home, crossing the border to come back home. No one would believe that there'd be a government crackdown on religious services, and no one would believe that journalists would be playing cover for some of the most overbearing and restricting policies in Canadian history. Okay, well, this is Canada, we have the CBC, so you might have guessed that one about government journalists, but no one would have believed that there'd be surgeries being canceled, patients being turned away, suicide and drug overdoses surging, Canadians dying, not because of the disease that's causing all this mayhem, but because of our government's overzealous reaction to the disease. No one would have thought any of that were possible, and yet here we are. And I think many in this audience would agree when I say that the cure has become worse than the disease. And of course, it's worth saying that we know that COVID-19 poses a serious threat to public health. It's deadly to many, and the shameful occurrences and deaths that happened at nursing homes across the country show that we did fail to protect some of the most vulnerable people in our society. But we've also learned a lot about the coronavirus since March of last year. We now know how the virus spreads. We know who are the most vulnerable, and we know the steps that are needed to take to protect those people. So tonight's discussion is not about the harmful effects of COVID. We all know what those are. We've been hearing about them over and over again. Instead, tonight's discussion is about the unintended consequences of our reaction to COVID, the heavy-handed government policies, the implications, be it medical, legal, cultural, or economic, to that reaction to COVID. So we've got a lot of ground to cover. We have some fantastic panelists who are far more qualified to speak about this issue than me. So let's get to it. First, this evening, we're going to hear from Dr. Shawn Whatley. Watley is a rural family doctor based in Mount Albert, Ontario. He is the author of the new book, When Politics Comes Before Patients, Why and How Canadian Medicare is Failing. And he's a Monk Senior Fellow in Health Policy with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Shawn has spent much of the last 20 years serving in various leadership roles for a number of boards, and he's also the past president of the Ontario Medical Association. After Shawn, we're going to hear from Mr. John Carpay. Carpay was born in the Netherlands and grew up in British Columbia. He speaks English, French, and Dutch. He holds a political science degree and a law degree. He was called to the bar in 1999 and has been an advocate for freedom and the rule of law in constitutional cases across Canada. He's the founder and president of the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms and has devoted his legal career to defending constitutional freedoms through litigation and education. In 2010, John received the Pyramid Award for Ideas in Public Policy in recognition of his work in constitutional advocacy and his success in building up and managing a nonprofit organization dedicated to defending citizens' freedom. Finally, last but not least, Anthony Furey, who is an author, journalist, and the national comment editor of the Toronto Sun and the Sun Media newspaper chains. Anthony was recently the morning host of the satellite radio Sirius XM show Canada Talks, and he's been a guest on some of the biggest shows in the world, including Fox News. He was on with Sean Hannity, BBC, and he's often the sole voice of reason over on a CBC panel. Anthony's written for Time Magazine, the Literary Review of Canada, the New York Daily News, to name a few. Nowadays, he's fearlessly pushing back against the groupthink that happens among his colleagues in the mainstream media, debunking their exaggerated claims and exposing their fear-mongering about COVID-19. And one fun fact about Anthony, he once stepped into the boxing ring and had a friendly jostle with our now Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. Anthony, I know that a lot of our viewers are a little envious of that left jab that you landed there. Anyway, I'm just kidding, no violence. No violence. We'll give each of the panelists the floor for about 10 minutes, followed by a group discussion that we're all going to have. And then we're going to open the floor up to our participants who will be allowed to ask live questions with the panelists. And to those watching on YouTube and Facebook, if you would like to join a future panel or have the opportunity to participate and ask questions live at our next event, please head on over to tnc.news/donate and become a True North Insider. Or alternatively, come join us at Civitas, become a member, head on over to civitascanada.ca where you can apply for membership. Okay, without further ado, let's hand it over to our panelists. First to you, Dr. Watley.
Thanks so much, Candice. I've really been looking forward to this panel, and not so much just for who's speaking, but the questions that are going to come, and you've done a brilliant job of actually setting it up and really described a lot of the details that we're facing. You know, every patient that I've seen for the last 20 years, I say, how can I help you? What can I do for you today? But for the last year, I've been saying, and how are you doing? So many people are finding this last year difficult on multiple levels, not just because they can't access care, cancer screening, services for their family members, a placement in long-term care homes, but just simply because of the whole pandemic itself, the nonstop news that is telling them something really, really bad is going to happen, worst case scenario planning, the necessity to stay in your home and wash your hands and wear a mask. And it's really been hard, at least on the patients that I'm trying to take care of. So it's been tough for me to try to make sense of this. And actually, Candice, you did a great job of adding a lot of sense making to the whole thing. But as a physician, as a policy person, how can I put this together? How can I make sense of people trying to access care for medical services, for COVID in particular, but how can we make sense of people not getting care for cancer care and surgery that's non-cancerous, but equally as crucial? How can we make sense of our lack of preparation as a healthcare system? So we only have 2.5 beds per 1,000 population, whereas the OECD has 4.7 beds in hospitals per 1,000 population. And on top of all this, we have over 100,000 scientific articles, 100,000 scientific articles in the literature published just on COVID-19 in 2020. And those publications started coming out around March. And so even if they were spread out on an equal basis, you're looking at 10,000 articles a month. If you took the weekends off, that's 500 articles a day just to stay abreast of the scientific literature on COVID-19. And that's leaving aside all the medical literature and the economic literature and every other discipline that's been out there writing about the COVID pandemic. So what I've found helpful is to apply a framework to this deluge of information in a way to help us sort and make sense of what's going on. And it's really just a 4-level framework. And I break it down in terms of care, coordination, culture, and then concepts. So care is just everything to do with the nuts and bolts of COVID itself. Candice, I'm glad you said we're not going to be talking about the nuts and bolts of virology and infectious diseases. That's fantastic. But all of that goes into that top level, the care level, and that's including vaccinations and how they work and that sort of thing. But equally important to care, we have a layer right beneath that of coordination. And coordination is where health policy lives. That's where regulatory reform lives, legislation. So that directly impacts how patients receive care. In the case of the pandemic, though, that coordination level, the policy level, actually impacts businesses, small businesses, schools, whether or not people get to have their wedding on time. So all sorts of things happen at the coordination level. And the general public, I find, has the greatest interest in those two levels, care and coordination. But beneath those, we have a level that I'm referring to as culture. And culture is just simply the collection of norms and behaviors that exist within any group. So at your workplace, if you start your meetings 15 minutes late, your culture at your organization is to start meetings 15 minutes late. You have a culture of lateness. It's just the way you do things. But beneath that culture is a layer of ideas that inform the culture. And most of us actually get into that idea level, unless you're a member of Civitas, right? We're a society where ideas meet and where we come to debate. But most people find it less interesting than those top two layers. So if you're always late in your organization, maybe the ideas that inform that are that thinking that being on time isn't important. Or maybe it's actually good to be late because you're being kind to the people who show up late. Maybe running meetings on time is actually impolite, and so it's actually morally bad to start meetings on time because you're being insensitive to all the late people. You get what I'm saying. Within that cultural level in healthcare, there are a whole bunch of norms and behaviors around how we make decisions, who gets to make decisions that inform the coordination of care or the experience of how the pandemic presents itself or how we experience it in our homes, in our businesses, in our communities, and also directly impacts that care level. So for example, in healthcare, whenever we have a problem, not enough beds in my hospital or not enough nurses or whatever, who do I call for help? I reach out to the government. I reach out to the Ministry of Health. Please help us. We need more funding. We need more beds. So that's a natural, that's a culturally accepted response within the Canadian healthcare context. But it's based on the presupposition of a benign view of government. We wouldn't reach out to government if we didn't think government was there to help us. If we thought government was by nature bad for us, we wouldn't ask government to help us. And so we never go about asking whether or not we should have a benign view of government or whether or not we do have a benign view of government, but that concept feeds the cultural level, which plays out at coordination, policy environment, and then actual bedside care. Another example might be people saying, you know what, it's not fair that some privileged people get to the front of the line for their COVID screens. They get to pay for a COVID swab. We need to pass a law to stop that. Well, the reflex or the knee jerk to ask government to pass laws to fix concrete problems presupposes legal instrumentalism. Now, John's probably going to tell me why I've got this wrong, and I hope he does, but within the legal community, you can look at the law as a tool to simply solve problems. So, for example, we don't have a good enough distribution of healthcare providers across your province. Let's pass a law and force doctors to go work up north or to go work in small towns. Well, that presupposes a view of the law, again, at the conceptual level of legal instrumentalism. Well, that's very different from a rule of law approach, which is an entirely different concept. So those concepts, and we could talk forever about those concepts because there's so many of them, they feed into that cultural level or the norms of decisions and behaviors that we see within healthcare. So for the last year, the Canadian public, everybody on this call, has had a backstage pass to the culture of healthcare. So everything that I've been living and breathing for the last 30 years or 20 years of practice is now front and center. It's on the front page of every newspaper. You've been able to see, how come people are making these decisions? How come regulations are this today and that way tomorrow and they're not applied? Or how come we have such regulatory unreasonableness? We're throwing people in prison, or we're fining them, maybe they're not going to prison, or we're taking little old ladies, throwing them out of the hospital because they held the hand of their dying husband during COVID. They broke the rule. They need to be thrown out of the hospital. How come this happens? Well, it happens because of the concepts that feed into the culture, that impact the coordination, and then ultimately the care level. So it's fine to understand or to have a framework to look at COVID, but ultimately, and I'm going to end here, we need to think about how we can influence through that framework into this mass of information and stories and dialogue and op-eds and videos and blogs. How can we as a group of people, ideas, start applying tactics to advance a strategy that will challenge bad concepts or faulty thinking, will advocate for ideal culture, so making decisions where they actually are closest to where they're going to have their impact. At least I'm portraying my bias now. Advocate for sound policy. Often people right of center leave the policy environment alone, right? Conservatives, classical liberals, and libertarians often say, we don't really want to get involved in policy because it sounds like big government. Well, if we don't get involved in policy and offer policy options of our own, it leaves that whole space wide open to everybody on the other side of the aisle. And so we need to have tactics to speak into that space. And we also need to think about how we're going to offer something positive at the care level. So I hope that's helpful. Huge, huge topic. And I'm looking forward to hearing what the other speakers say. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Shawn. I'm sure we'll get into some of those suggestions and policy ideas in the Q&A. So next we'll leave it up to John Carpay for his talk.
Thank you very much, Candice. And I'm deeply honored to be part of this panel and with such esteemed guests. And I'm going to talk briefly about the court actions that the Justice Center has on the go, and also what are some of the issues in court that we're going to be tackling. So currently we have anti-lockdown court actions in British Columbia, Alberta, and Manitoba. Saskatchewan hopefully will be filed by the end of this month, and Ontario is also on the horizon as well. We also have an action in federal court against the prison hotels or hotel prisons, and the legal test. So our argument is that these lockdown measures are an unjustifiable violation of our charter freedoms to move and travel and associate and assemble and worship. And more recently with the federal quarantine measures, we're now also looking at Charter Section 7 through 14, the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. So the basic right that we all have to not be locked up somewhere. And currently an accused murderer in Canada has more legal rights than a returning snowbird. Because if you're accused of a crime, you must be charged with a crime before you get arrested. Once arrested, you have a right to contact a lawyer. You have a right to have your detention reviewed within 24 hours before a justice of the peace or a judge. You have the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. You have the right to a fair trial before an independent and impartial tribunal. And usually when you get arrested, your friends and family will know where you are. Are you at the police station? Are you in a temporary remand center? Are you in prison? So all of these rights are just completely tossed out the window with the new federal policies. Now, the test laid out by the Supreme Court of Canada in a case called Oakes, O-A-K-E-S, and it's a test with 4 components. And so the first one is, does the government have a pressing public policy objective? serious pressing objective. And so on this issue in court, governments are going to argue that COVID is an unusually deadly killer that we should all be very afraid of. This is a very, well, as Jason Kenney has stated publicly on more than one occasion, that this is like the Spanish flu. Now, that's easy to say that as at a news conference and frighten people, but the evidence that we will be putting forward, government evidence, government statistics, is that COVID is not an unusually deadly killer. The impact on population life expectancy is minimal. We know that roughly 80% of the deaths are amongst people who are elderly and already sick with cancer, heart disease, emphysema, diabetes, etc. So the impact on population life expectancy is minimal. Years of life lost analysis, which we're working on, I think will confirm that COVID is not having the big scary impact that the politicians and chief medical officers are making it out to be. The most important thing is the government will have to produce evidence. Right now, they've just been running a campaign of fear for 12 months, supported by biased pro-lockdown media that tell us about all these scary case numbers, which brings me to another issue in the court cases. We're going to challenge the legitimacy and validity of the PCR tests, which were never designed to diagnose COVID, but are now frightening the population with screaming headlines about another 2,000 cases in Ontario and 3,000 new cases in Quebec. We have to remember that until 12 months ago, the word case referred to a sick person. Now, anybody who's got a positive test on with the PCR test is deemed to be a so-called case. And I wonder how many members of the public know when they see the scary headline about 2,000 new cases that involves 40, 50, maybe 60 people who are actually sick, and the other 1,900 and something people are perfectly healthy. So pressing objective is kind of the first issue. The onus is on the government to show that the charter violating measures, and I don't think the government will dispute that these health orders are violating our charter freedoms. I think that's kind of a no-brainer, and I think the government would look foolish in court if they tried to argue that, well, no, these are not charter violations. I mean, obviously they are. When you can get a $1,000 ticket for associating with your mother in your own home at Christmas time, obviously that's a violation of freedom of association. When you're told that you cannot sing in church, obviously a violation of religious freedom. When you get ticketed for being at a peaceful protest, that's obviously a violation of your charter freedom of peaceful assembly, etc. So the next part of the test is rational connection. So the government measure has to be rationally connected to the objective. The objective presumably is to save lives, although I would argue you can't really save lives, you can only delay death. We're all going to die, but maybe that's just semantics. The government's going to say that these measures are rationally connected, because if we have mask wearing and social distancing and capacity limits and shutting down businesses and forcing kids to wear masks and so on and so forth, that those measures actually save lives. The onus will be on the government to prove that lockdowns actually save lives, and they have to show that direct causal connection, which raises another issue in the court actions, which is the whole question of asymptomatic spread. We're going to have medical experts on our side testifying that asymptomatic people, healthy people, are not significant spreaders of the virus, and we've got the science there. It'll be interesting to see what science the government comes up with. I've asked the Alberta government repeatedly, what science are you relying on for your belief that asymptomatic people are significant spreaders of COVID? And I get stonewalled. I get no answer. And I'm looking forward to the court actions, because the government is, they can try to stonewall the judge, but they're not going to look very good when we're saying that asymptomatic people are not significant spreaders of the virus. Hence, most, if not all, lockdown measures are not producing any benefits. If the government wants to remain silent, that'll be up to them. But I would anticipate they're going to try to muster up some science to back up their position. So rational connection, and the goal is important here as well, because initially we were told, oh, no, we can't stop a virus. Never in human history have lockdowns succeeded in stopping a virus. It's out and about, it's everywhere. So is the goal to flatten the curve, in which case we get into this whole question of hospitals being overrun? We would argue that this is a longstanding endemic problem. It's not caused by COVID. And the government, would have to, I guess, make up its mind as to whether these measures are just to flatten the curve. We're not going to save any lives, but we're only doing this to try to make sure that the hospitals don't get overwhelmed, which is what I heard in March and April. But now it seems to be this across the board generic effort to just save lives by stopping the spread. It's kind of a much broader and vaguer objective. The next part of the Oakes test, minimal impairment. So do the government measures violate rights and freedoms as little as possible, or could they be saving lives, assuming they are in the first place? Could they do so through less onerous measures? And this will be a good opportunity to challenge some of the stupid rules, like in British Columbia, 6 strangers can sit together at a table and eat together, but houses of worship are closed. Where's the science behind that? The last and perhaps most significant portion is harms versus benefits. Do lockdown harms outweigh benefits, or do the benefits outweigh the harms? The Justice Center released a paper. It's on our website, www.jccf.ca. It's called Flying Blind. And we delve into deaths from canceled surgeries, deaths from delayed cancer diagnosis, increases in suicides, increases in drug overdoses. You could write many, many books on lockdown harms. And, we've got higher unemployment, which there is research saying there's a statistical correlation and probably causation. Higher unemployment means higher suicides. All of the mental health issues, what happens to people when they're forced into isolation and loneliness? What about all the stress and anxiety and depression? And we could go on and on and on and on and on. And sadly, governments, even apart from any court actions, governments are required by the Charter to actively consider harms of these measures. And what we found with our research team, having spent hundreds of hours trying to gather information and get information, lots of FOI requests, lots of internet research on government websites, and the conclusion we've come to is that governments are not deliberately, actively looking to investigate and study and fully understand all of the lockdown harms. We see willful blindness at play, which is very sad, and something that we will be drawing the attention of the courts to the government's willful blindness in not aggressively trying to measure and analyze and investigate all of the lockdown harms. It's a big battle. We are, currently looking to hire 4 more lawyers. We're getting some great applications. We're doing interviews, so we're going to expand the legal team from 9 to 13. These are huge, huge court actions with massive amounts of evidence. So they will be tough battles. The government has to win on all 4 points. The government has to persuade the court that that COVID is truly an unusually deadly killer that warrants government action that violates charter rights and freedoms. They have to really make the case that this is a pressing objective. They have to show that the lockdown measures are rationally connected to the goal of saving lives. They have to show that they are impairing our rights and freedoms as little as possible. And they have to show that the lockdown the government has to show that the lockdown benefits outweigh the harms. The government has to win on all 4 points. I think before a fair-minded judge, they have an uphill fight. But of course, I've always said anybody who predicts a court outcome is a fool. You never know what's going to happen. So I'm not predicting that we will win or lose, but these battles are important to be fought. And I think one of the side benefits, even if we lose all of our court cases in every province, the wonderful thing is the government will, for the very first time, have to answer some tough questions, and they will have to produce some evidence, and they will not be able to coast by with on the basis of biased pro-lockdown media beating the drum of fear and just making scary announcements at news conferences. The government will have to actually answer some tough questions in court. So again, thank you very much for having me on this panel tonight.
Great. Well, thank you so much, John, for your contribution and the work that you're doing offline as well to sort of, expose what's really happening in the country. And I think it's a good segue to our next panelist, Anthony Furey, who's going to talk about both the sort of biased media elements that you touched on, John, and also the culture at large and how we got here. So over to you, Mr. Furey.
Hey guys, great to be here. John, I'm really offended that you haven't started the legal challenge in Ontario yet. Almost every other province. We're such a backwater here in Ontario. Please hurry it up.
Okay.
But it's great to be here to speak to everyone, and great comments from Shawn and from John. And I want to pick up on something Candice was saying in her introduction about journalists playing cover for some of the most overbearing policies really ever that's going on right now. And I would contend that to tie into everything that's been said before me, I think shoddy media coverage and media coverage lacking context and nuance and the usual sort of critical questions that one would expect of journalists and that they have traditionally done in the past, that is all, the absence of those good questions and the presence of all this shoddy media coverage, I think it's one of the key reasons why we're so stuck in this rut, this situation we're in right now, where public opinion is bizarrely high in support of some of these lockdowns, and why it's hard to get politicians to move, and why it's so difficult to get traction in all of this. Here I am in downtown Toronto, which is supposed to be a very cosmopolitan, worldly place, and everyone's always patting themselves on the back about all of that. And yet how shockingly ignorant and unworldly everybody in my immediate area and in Toronto and GTA and Ontario has become these past 12 months, that there's a lack of awareness of what's going on, how other countries are dealing with coronavirus, how other jurisdictions all across North America are, various United States, whether they are led by Republicans or left-leaning Democrats, they're all sort of finding much more productive ways to reopen. But somehow that doesn't hit Canadian coverage, even though in the past, of course, you would get ad nauseum coverage. You get more coverage of what Donald Trump is up to than what Justin Trudeau is up to. So somehow we've gone from being very worldly to very closed-minded. Ontario parents, for example, are not aware of the fact that in BC, small children do not have to wear masks in the classroom, or that we send pretty much the entire classroom home. If one kid has a positive case, we send them home for 14 days in Ontario. Sometimes they choose just random other classes to send home. They'll send like 2 or 3 classes home. It's not done in other jurisdictions, but people are not given the knowledge that is the case. They're not sort of empowered to seek out best practices and to seek out reference points. So everybody's kind of been put into these, have these different blinders on when it comes to the things that the knowledge and information they're sort of exposed to. And I think this is a major problem, the lack of nuance, the lack of context. And I would say the most radical thing that a member of the public can actually do is go to the original source and go and read your province's daily COVID reports or weekly COVID reports, because we do live in an era of open data. And while there is information that I think should be in those reports that is not, they are fairly comprehensive and they tell interesting stories. The Ontario charts, for instance, they show that in recent weeks, there's practically 0 new cases in long-term care, 0 deaths among long-term care residents. Well, hold on a second. That was the original crisis. That was the reason sort of for the first wave lockdowns. Okay, so that's interesting. That story's not being told, though. We see that people over 80 used to have a much greater percentage. They do a decade breakdown in Ontario of who has cases. And now I think today it's something like 25 people 80 plus are in these COVID counts, whereas a month ago it would have been 200 people or so, and that's the high risk people. And that's kind of one of the reasons we're doing all of these lockdowns. That information is not getting out there. John referenced, poor questions, not real questions, not really challenging people. And it's quite something to watch a full press conference and watch the statements, then watch all the media questions after. And I participated in some of them sometimes, asking these questions. Most of the questions are generally about, okay, but how can we actually get further into lockdown? And I had to chuckle at one reporter who was really kind of pushing to say, well, can't we lock down harder than we've ever locked down before? And this was, of course, just a week ago, when the situation is better than it's ever been before. So it's a very bizarre and troubling phenomenon to watch unfold. And I think there's just, I don't know why there's a lack of interest in so many people in the media in telling a more nuanced, contextualized story that tells greater data. I know of infectious disease physicians, ICU doctors who are treating COVID patients, who they are actively on a regular basis emailing, corresponding with journalists and saying, there's some big errors in your story. I just want to let you know I'm kind of troubled by all of this. And a lot of them don't really have an interest in correcting the record. I had an exchange, I won't name the publication or the reporter, but there's a story on schools reopening, I guess, after this last break in Ontario, a story maybe from back in January. And they were talking about all the different sort of concerns around reopened schools, how it could be a disaster. And they said, and of course, some children have died of coronavirus here. And I wrote to the reporter, I said, what are you talking about? I mean, this is an influential publication. There's not, like, no school child in Ontario has died of coronavirus. Why is this in this story, like, misleading parents like this? And they kind of wrote back huffily and said, well, if I checked the the Canadian tab on all deaths by year, it says there are 3 people under the age of 20 who have died of coronavirus in Canada. So, I mean, technically it's true. I said, well, I watched this stuff in great detail, and I can tell you the individual stories about all 3 of those people and who they are. And one's a 19-year-old, so not a school child. Toronto Public Health said the 7-year-old girl who died did not die of coronavirus. She died with coronavirus, but Toronto Public Health was very clear that it was not the contributor to her death. So I said to this person, why are you lying in this story? This is an error. And then, of course, the conversation ghosted away, and they weren't interested in having that piece of information in that story, and they never corrected the record. But not only do they not have an interest in telling these contextual stories that I really think would help Canadians see a fuller picture of what's going on, and then be able to better make their personal risk assessments about their health and make their own determinations about whether or not these various restrictions are necessary, but they actively punish other people who do it. And I have been on the receiving end of this in some very bizarre ways. Back at the end of last year, I wrote several stories about comorbidity data. And I'll credit the Alberta government for having the most sort of rigorous comorbidity open data platform out there. And what you find, and John touched upon this earlier, is that in Alberta, and I'm sure it's pretty similar in all other provinces, that about 75% of the people who've died of coronavirus had 3 or more underlying medical conditions. And then something like a lot more, like 18% had 2 or more, and then there's some that are 1. And the people who had no underlying medical conditions is about, I think it's about 4% right now. And that 4% also includes people in their 80s, 90s, and 100s who didn't have underlying medical conditions but still died of it all. And I wrote this, and the story quoted, very prominent infectious disease experts who are cross-pointed at universities and so forth. I mean, very rigorous stories. And that is the story that I believe I was denounced by Patty Hadju for spreading dangerous misinformation. Justin Trudeau kind of obliquely referred to it as well as something to be denounced and so forth. I understand Dina Henshaw had to kind of downplay it at a press conference as well. And this is 100% verified facts that are right up there to see. And it's absolutely disturbing that this was all said. And we know that if somebody dares, in the United States, the former president, he was a bit critical with people like that, Jim Acosta and so forth. And we ought to rally behind Jim Acosta and make him some sort of international icon because the president criticized him and so forth. And here, Patty Hadju calls my work dangerous misinformation, even though it's just directly from the Alberta government website. And I guess, my media colleagues across the country were satisfied with her saying that about me. And in fact, there were pieces in CBC and another news outlet that basically took my work and denounced it, called it misinformation. They managed to find one doctor who, to that person's discredit, was willing to attach their name to that piece and so forth. It was very, very bizarre. And I will say CBC and another outlet had to make revisions to their piece, and I did not have to make any revisions to my piece, and they're still standing intact online because they're 100% correct. I had a similar situation, I guess, a few weeks ago, where we found out that a doctor who was doing a lot of advising to the Ontario government and also was talking about whether schools should be opened or closed and so forth, he had actually been paid by a teachers union here to offer an argument in a court case against the government for teachers' issues. So I sort of reported this. The doctor, when we got in touch with him, did not deny it. He confirmed it. And then the story hit, and there was bizarre attacks against me, and they managed to get Chrystia Freeland to make a statement kind of standing up for this doctor and so forth, and people labeling it this, that, and the other. Story is 100% correct. It's still up there, now. There's no errors with it. I think parents had a right to know that very basic information, but for whatever reason, I was attacked for all of that, and media seemed okay with that, even though they usually talk a big game about freedom of the press, why politicians shouldn't criticize the media. So they punish that. Experts who are very highly credentialed but don't support lockdowns do not get the media presence and coverage that they should, although I will say it is starting to change a little bit. And they punish you. They punish the general public. They punish the broader community by bringing in bizarre attempts to shut down people's social media and so forth for saying things that, well, I don't know. I just want to wrap here on Facebook has introduced new rules on things that they're going to delete. And one of them, here's what they say. They say, COVID-19 is no more dangerous than the flu. So that's something that will get your account shut down. Posts that deny the existence of COVID-19 or downplay it are banned. Any claim that the number of deaths from COVID-19 is much lower than the official figure must include additional information or context. And that can get you banned and your post removed and so forth. Okay, well, Canadian pediatricians, very top-ranking prominent ones, have said in an open letter that coronavirus is less dangerous than the flu in children. So that's not the exact sentence Facebook used, but should those doctors who are much more experts in coronavirus than whoever's posting this at Facebook, should they have their Facebook accounts shut down for giving their formed opinion on coronavirus in children? And then when they go on to say Facebook that the deaths are much lower than they are, Statistics Canada says that 9% of coronavirus deaths are actually deaths of other things like cancers and so forth. That's the number they use. So should Statistics Canada's website be shut down or something, or should Facebook not allow you to link to Statistics Canada because of all of this? So I guess I kind of know what Facebook's trying to do, but they realize they should realize they're not actually allowing a contextual and nuanced conversation about all the stuff that we should be talking about here, but we're not allowed to because the politicians aren't talking about it. My other colleagues in the media won't allow us to do it, and apparently big tech wants to censor it. So it's a very troubling situation we're in right now.
Right. Thank you, Anthony, for those remarks. I definitely know how you feel. I think at one point I wrote an article about how, everyone's focusing on the case numbers, but they're not focusing on the fact that we're testing 10 times as many people as we were compared to the last wave. And I got attacked by all these other journalists. It's as soon as you say something that falls from the narrative, you're just open for attack from these sort of institutional powers. So
and yet they evolved to that, because the interesting thing is they now say they would have attacked you. That would have been months ago.
It was, yeah.
They acknowledge that's true. So now journalists say, oh, well, percent positivity is actually what matters, which deals with the thing you're addressing. But they attack you first, and then a few weeks later, they realize how ignorant they are. So they have to adapt to the fact, oh, Candice was right all along. Like the comorbidity data reporting that I did. Well, comorbidity stats are now used to determine who's more front of the line for vaccines. So obviously it's a very important thing for us to talk about. So all these things they attack us for, they have to sheepishly admit we're right about later. It is so troubling.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I hope we, in the Q&A, we can get into sort of understanding why this is and why there seems to be an agenda by people, in positions of power in government and media and tech, as you outlined. But before we get into a couple more questions, I was wondering if anyone on the panel wanted to respond to anything anyone else was saying. Shawn, I know you spoke first. It seemed like you were sort of itching to jump in at certain points of John and Anthony's discussion. So I'll give it over to you, Shawn, if you want to make any comments.
Well, thank you so much, Candice. And actually, I loved everything both of those guys said. It was fantastic. And I was actually regretting not packing more details into my opening remarks, because they got to throw in so many good details. It was fantastic. But I guess it speaks to my initial comments that there is so much information that we could attack here. Just the difference between a case versus an actual positive test, and what kind of test, PCR versus antibody testing, and so on. What do you do if you have a positive test and someone who has no symptoms? So that's all at that care level. And we could, I mean, docs debate at whole conferences on, you know, what's the definition of illness? And yet all of this is being thrown out into the public, and people are reading like mad on how to, like the comments John made in the things that he's feeding into his court case. I'm just like, wow, he is an expert on this. He's clearly read, you know, I don't know how many thousands of papers, Anthony as well. And you just don't see that kind of attention to a particular disease, you know, SARS-CoV-2, and everybody's reading so much about this, and it's being discussed in the public forum. So I worry that, you know, do we have any way to make sense of it all, to take a step back? And so I just want to make a shout out to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. They published, I'm a fellow there, as Candice said, but they published the COVID-19 Misery Index. And what they did is they looked at 16 different data feeds, and these are all publicly available, and they chose these data feeds based on what other large studies tend to use when they're comparing healthcare systems. And they looked at 15 different healthcare systems around the world. Canada was one of them, and we ranked 11th out of 15. But the nice thing about it, not just the fact that they tried to quantify suffering. Suffering by definition is a subjective experience, but it's important enough that we need to quantify it. So they broke it down into the burden of disease. What was the impact of the disease itself on Canada? So case counts, deaths, how many severe cases, how many patients needed to be in ICU. But then they also looked at the misery caused by our response to it. So in other words, how strict were we with our stay-at-home orders, our lockdowns, border closures? How good a job did we do with our vaccination program, and so on? And then the third bucket is looking at the economic misery. What was the change to the GDP? What were the employment levels changing by? How much did our debt increase? How much did our borrowing increase? And so I think we need somehow to guide people towards these compilations of information, because I mean, even just to suck everything out of John's head and everything out of Anthony's head, we would all be overwhelmed. They know so much about this topic. So how can we inform those of us in our family, the people we work with, in such a way that they can go out and speak confidently to start influencing change, influencing the people that they bump into to change towards some semblance of sanity. So I would love to hear, Candice, your thoughts on that, John and Anthony's thoughts. I agree taking people to court is a great way to force change, hopefully, if you win. But how can the average person who's listening in the audience start educating themselves, but with a view towards change, as opposed to just becoming uber experts on the different types of vaccines that are out there? So I'll just throw that out there. Thanks so much.
I'll go first if that's all right. We've got a brochure the Justice Centre has produced called "The Deadly Cost of Lockdowns," and it's our goal to see 1 million of these printed and distributed, put into the mailboxes of Canadian homes and being distributed by people at their, places of work, places of worship, places of I guess recreation and entertainment. Except those are mostly shut down now. These lockdowns are not going away unless and until the public opinion shifts, in my view, and top priority should be to kill the fear. And we're working on some papers to try to target that and try to come out with the data and the facts that, some people cannot be persuaded. When we're in a state of fear, we tend to think poorly or not at all. When we're in a state of fear, we're into this mode, do something now, do something now. And of course, lockdowns are very attractive because, hey, we're doing something. But I think there is a big chunk of the population, maybe a quarter, maybe a third, maybe half, who are open-minded. They're not strongly anti-lockdown. They're not strongly pro-lockdown. So you got a big chunk of the population that is open to persuasion. So we're going to get these million brochures out there and get people reading them and get people thinking. And it's just kind of a, chipping away. How have any other public policy debates transformed, right? You think about something like you go from sodomy as a criminal code offense to gay marriage as the law of the land. Now that took several decades, but that was a 180-degree shift in thinking. I don't think we can afford decades to try and turn public opinion around on lockdowns, but it's just a lot of hard work, and it's hard work that needs to get done, because as long as people are terrified of this disease, this virus, they will continue to embrace all kinds of, massive and irrational violations of their rights and freedoms. So everybody needs to just roll up their sleeves, whether in an individual capacity or, if you're leading some organization, we just got to roll up our sleeves and do the hard work of shifting public opinion.
Anthony, did you have anything to add?
Well, I think John's completely right about the point that it's really public opinion that's going to make things change. There's a Leger poll from a few weeks ago that really I got kind of depressed after I read it, because it shows Canadians really do love their lockdowns. It's kind of disturbing to read some of these polls. And one of them asked, when should lockdowns end? It was the opinion poll. And one of the answers, 20% of respondents said 6 months after all Canadians have received their vaccines, have been fully vaccinated. And I feel like anybody who's fully informed of this whole conversation is thinking even just a little bit about this. That is an irrational, surreal 6 months after everybody is fully vaccinated. Well, the vaccine is not yet mandatory. We'll see in all of this. So, I mean, everybody isn't going to be vaccinated. It's it is just bizarre. So that's kind of what we're dealing with here right now in terms of some public opinion, a certain segment of society really embracing lockdowns.
It's incredibly sad. While we're on the topic of vaccines, maybe I'll put this one towards you, Shawn, and then others can comment on it. But I mean, we've seen an abysmal rollout of these vaccines in Canada. Health officials, including the federal Minister of Health, have said the vaccinated Canadians will still be subject to the same lockdowns and restrictions even after getting vaccinated. And then we're also seeing, the so-called bad strain in Europe, and some of the vaccines now being recalled and not being implemented. First, do you think that Canadians should be concerned about the vaccines and any long-term effects, especially because they were so rushed in being developed? But then also with the idea of all these new variants, is it possible that the vaccine will actually protect Canadians against COVID? What about new variants? Is this something that we might have to start taking every single year? And then maybe the other panelists can comment about what your answer is, and maybe what that will do for the future of lockdowns and our economy and our society.
Yeah, great question. And it's fascinating to see that the same people who have a total lack of fear about COVID itself and lockdown seem to have an almost irrational fear when it comes to the vaccine itself. So we could argue that both camps have a rational fear, but just placed on different things. So I think it'd be wise to have our eyes open and to look at whatever products we put into our body, try to make sure they've been tested, try to ask our physicians, does this make sense? Does this seem reasonable? As far as I understand, the vaccines have been tested. They seem to be safe. I took one, not so much to protect myself, but to protect my patients. I see a lot of elderly people. I don't want to pass something on to them. But with the vaccine itself, as far as rollouts go, I was talking with my office staff just this week, and I said to them, we could have predicted that it would be the fiasco that it is. Every single fall with the flu vaccine, we put in a request, and so doctors' offices have to request to public health, can we get our vaccine batch? And if you put your request in too soon, your request is, they say, no, it's denied because it's too soon. It has to be submitted at the right time. If you submit it just a tiny bit too late, then you're behind everybody else. Well, the pharmacies get to request directly to the Ministry of Health, and so they have a completely different supply stream. So the pharmacies end up with the vaccine first. So that's a frustration in itself when our patients are asking us for the vaccine, but they give us a few little doses, a small little basket. We use those up in a day or two, then we wait for the next supply, the next shipment. Week or two later, we get some more. This happens all fall where we don't have enough. until in January, we get a whole dump of all that's left over, and nobody wants the vaccine at that point because it's not really necessary, and so it goes to waste. So this is standard operating procedure. So I was talking about the cultural level and the type of decisions and governance that happens within healthcare itself. Well, we're seeing this sort of thinking and approach writ large now at a national level for our vaccine program. Now, it's an analogy, and it's not exactly the same, obviously, but I'm just saying we shouldn't be too surprised when we see these vaccine rollout fiascos, when we experience it every year with the flu vaccine.
Okay. The specter of mandatory vaccines I find terrifying for many reasons. Just one of them is, if we have public policy right now that is so not science-based, in my view, science is not going to really protect us from mandatory vaccines, because all these policies are being rolled out without much of a logical basis. Even in Quebec with the curfew, I was told, and I did not personally observe this, but I was told that at a news conference, either the premier or the chief medical officer was asked, will this 8 p.m. curfew have an impact to reduce the number of cases? And the answer was, we don't know, we have no idea. I'm thinking, you want to give up your freedom to be able to go outside after 8 p.m. without walking a dog? Because, you can go outside if you walk a dog. I guess dogs are guardians against COVID or something. But there is so little science and logic and intelligence behind so many of these measures. And so what frightens me about the vaccines is that if you're going to say, well, if the vaccines, they don't make you not contagious, but everybody has to have one. It's like, well, where's the logic there, right? If that's true, that the vaccine does not make you uncontagious, I don't know what the correct word is, we'll say not contagious. If that's true, why can't it just be left to each individual person? And so that I, as a healthy 53-year-old, would say, well, this has not been subjected to long-term testing, and I'll take my chances, thank you very much. Why do I have to take the vaccine if it's not even going to help me to be not contagious? So from a legal standpoint, if the government introduces mandatory vaccination, it would be the same test. Is the vaccine to be used against some unusually deadly killer that really warrants it? Is it a pressing objective? Is there a rational connection between forcing the vaccination either directly or indirectly and getting a better outcome? Is vaccination the least intrusive way to protect society from this supposedly unusually deadly killer? And what are the harms of the vaccines versus the benefits of the vaccines? That would be the legal test that would be applied. And we are slowly getting ready for this. We'll be releasing in the months ahead, we'll be releasing a substantive legal opinion on mandatory vaccination.
Canada, and this sort of speaks to you, John, but I think everyone can discuss it. Canada was a country founded on fundamental freedoms. Conservative politicians talk a good game about protecting freedom. You hear it a lot. Liberals claim to be the party of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And yet now we have both parties that have just completely abandoned this notion. You rarely hear about our charter rights. And instead, it feels like the decisions are being made by unelected health bureaucrats. It feels like a health dictatorship. So I guess it's a pretty simple question, but how did we get here? How did we get to a place where Canadians are just so willing to give up their freedoms to experts? And to mention something that Shawn said early in his address, I mean, there's so much literature and there's so much contradicting information and there's so much we still are learning. And there's so many different elements to weigh against one another. It's not just about the deadliness of one virus. There's so many other factors. So how did we get here? If you can each just, take a few minutes to try to answer that very complex question, and then we'll open it up to the floor.
I think the short answer is cultural rot. Culture shapes politics, politics shapes law. And, the charter is only as strong as the commitment that the appointed judges have to our fundamental freedoms. The Justice Center has done a judicial freedom index looking at the attitudes of different Supreme Court justices towards our fundamental freedoms. and that's on our website. You know, you mentioned the medical dictatorship. This is a serious problem. This is an argument that we are raising in our court actions. In addition to the charter arguments, we're saying that Canada's constitution requires democratic accountability. It requires that the governed have input into the laws that govern us. And the way our democracy is supposed to work is that we elect the representatives, and the representatives pass the law. So at least we have an indirect say into the content of those laws. That's been completely tossed out the window in the last 12 months, where you have an unelected, unaccountable chief medical officer, not merely exercising what I think are probably legitimate Public Health Act powers to quarantine sick people. You know, it's one thing, and we do have the legislation on the books that's been there for a long time, that the chief medical officer can order and even force sick people into quarantine. Okay, I guess a hardcore libertarian might disagree even with that, but you know, that's something that is at least, you know, reasonable or arguably a legitimate law. What we've got now is chief medical officers making laws of broad application that apply to the entire population, released, you know, changed from week to week, from month to month, without any visible or transparent input from elected representatives. So democracy has just really gone down the toilet, to use proper legal terminology, in the last year, and we're raising this in our court actions, in addition to the charter arguments.
Anthony, did you want to add to that?
Well, I guess the first place we really went wrong was our deviation from the plans. It's an incredibly disheartening and maddening experience to read through Canada's various pandemic preparedness plans, whether they be federal, provincial, or local units do it. It's an incredibly disheartening experience, but both a very positive and a negative experience to speak, as I've done a number of times with retired Lieutenant Colonel David Redmond, because you listen to someone who goes, "This is how we will solve this problem," and you just listen to it and you go, "That just seems to make so much sense." So it's great to know that A, you're not crazy, that B, there is actually a way to deal with this better than this madness. But then you realize how far afield we are from doing that. These preparedness plans are really interesting. They all presuppose a greater clinical attack rate than we have right now, meaning a much greater percentage of Canadians get sick with an illness. They never at all suggest lockdowns of society. The main thing they talk about is, just so you know, your business may have issues because people will get sick, or they will have to stay home to care for sick loved ones. So you'd need to come up with a contingency plan. It's all about kind of serving society as opposed to making society serve their goals. They presuppose that ICUs will be at 170% capacity during a pandemic. The highest we've hit, and Shawn, please correct me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like no hospital's broken 110 in Ontario or in Canada, which isn't that out of step with general flu season anyway. So you're saying, and at 170% ICU capacity, they still talk about ways to manage the system, not this very odd argument that you need to, you know, rope off the children's playground with caution tape, lest, you know, a low risk person get it, passes to low risk to a high risk, and then a hospital bed and so forth. I mean, it's really all of the plans, whether it's Colonel Redmond or Theresa Tam's document that she wrote in 2018, are all about what are the problems, isolate the variables, solve those problems. And we are not doing that right now, any of it.
Absolutely. And Shawn, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I would. Please, thanks so much. So yeah, building off what Anthony just said, when you look at actually the total numbers, so using Ontario as an example, we peaked at around 1,600 admitted patients to hospital with COVID, at around 400 of those were in our ICUs. Well, the Ford government added 3,100 beds in 2020, 1,500 of which were ICU beds. So if all the new COVID beds were in one giant COVID hospital, and we put all of our COVID patients into that COVID hospital, it would be a little more than half full, and our ICU would be almost 70% empty. So we can't blame the challenges and the difficulties of the healthcare system itself on COVID. However, in some places, COVID has made it a lot worse. Just very quickly, will me getting the vaccine help my patients? Well, if I have a lower viral load myself, there's a lower likelihood that I'm going to shed viruses onto my patients. At least that's what I'm hoping, until we have better long-term studies on whether or not me getting vaccinated truly helps my patients. I may be proved to be wrong completely, but I'm trying to take the hopeful glass half full approach on it, as I do with the influenza vaccine every year as well. I don't take it for myself. I take it hopefully to protect my patients, and I hope I'm not proved wrong there. But your initial question, Candice, was how did we get here? How did we lose our freedoms? And I want to just do a shout out to this book here, James Burnham, The Managerial Revolution from the mid-1940s. I think it was the early 1940s. And he said that we no longer have society run by governments. We have society run by a managerial class, so a group of experts and managers, and they're the ones that are making decisions. So we have expert advisory panels, and you can't get rid of them. They're really, really smart. They're good at what they do, and they tend to stick around forever. And so although we lobby governments to make changes, it's this managerial class, and they exist not just in government, but in media, in academia, and elsewhere. Now, I'll close with this comment. We're actually mixing two different kinds of ethics. So I'm guided by a deontological normative ethical principle, which means I have a duty to provide care to you. Public health has a duty to provide care to a population. So they are guided by a consequentialist ethics or a utilitarian approach. They want to do the greatest good for the least harm to everybody. So when you butt those two approaches head to head, inevitably you end up with problems. And to John's points earlier about the Oakes test, it reminds me of a paper written by an ethicist in Ontario where he broke it down into 4 principles, where our first principle is to think about Mill's harm principle. So we're allowed to restrict freedom to prevent harm, but it's unethical to restrict freedom to decrease harm to the individual himself. We're not allowed to do that. That's unethical. And so what we're seeing right now is straying into that protecting a person for his own good. I know better for you what you should be doing, so I'll restrict your freedom to make your life better. Well, that's unethical. And that's a completely different approach than saying I'm going to restrict your freedom so that you don't punch someone else in the face. I think everybody agrees on that restriction of freedom. So you've asked a huge question. How did we get down this path of restricting freedom? What are the ethical principles involved? How are they different for the public health officer versus the physician versus the member of parliament? But fascinating question, and thanks for asking it.
So I guess that managerial class is like the precursor for Trump's deep state, right? That's the same group of people we're talking about here. All right, well, thank you so much. We're going to open it up now to the floor. So to everyone watching, if you would like to ask a question live personally to our panelists, all you have to do is there's a little icon that says raise hand. So you can raise your hand, we'll call upon you, we'll elevate you up onto the panel. You'll have 1 minute to ask a question. We have about 20 minutes or so left on this panel. So we're going to limit you to a minute or less to ask a question, and then we'll go through the panelists. We'll each try to answer as well in a minute or so that we can get through as many questions as possible. So we'll start with our friend Roy Epen, who has his hand up. So we will elevate Roy up onto the panel. Hi,
I want to thank the 4 of you for talking about this subject, because I've been despairing in my private life about all of this. My question is about the reaction of our regulatory agencies. So I'm a physician, as you know, and I find that many of my colleagues and I are afraid to say anything because our colleges have been slapping the wrists quite hard of some of the people who have actually spoken out, like my friend Matt Strauss and Dr. Cower. And I think that our regulators have become a problem too.
The Justice Centre has represented Dr. Chris Milburn in Nova Scotia, who wrote a column in the Halifax Chronicle Herald. It wasn't about COVID, but it was just his opinion on what was going on in the emergency room. They sent an intimidating letter to him. We sent a very stern legal warning letter reminding the college that it is a government body. It is bound by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms to respect the freedom of expression of doctors, whether it's about COVID or lockdowns or anything else. So I've repeatedly told all kinds of doctors in various email exchanges. If you get a nasty letter from your college, contact the Justice Center. We will give you pro bono legal representation. And I would just encourage doctors to keep on speaking out, because you have more credibility than a lawyer like myself, or journalist, media person, whatever. When a doctor comes out and says, COVID is real, but fear of COVID is exaggerated, or if a doctor says lockdowns are causing far more harm than good, people sit up and take notice. And it is the most powerful thing in the public arena is for medical doctors to speak out against lockdowns. And the Justice Center is very happy to write a very nasty letter to your college, put them in their place. The Nova Scotia College backed off immediately because we had the legal research and the case law, and just saying you have no business censoring the speech of doctors. That is the law. And if you want to proceed with this, we will be happy to take you to court, and we'll be happy to publicize everything that you're doing as well. So that's my contribution.
John, I want to say on behalf of physicians everywhere, thank you for your help. I think that's fantastic. Unfortunately, by the time you engage with lawyers in court and stuff like that, you've wasted so much time and been away from your patients for so long that everybody's in pain and suffering, although hopefully you win. And so Roy raises a great point about regulatory unreasonableness, and have we actually lost what it means to do? Certainly self-regulation. The last registrar of the Ontario College said it should be moved into the dustbin of history. And they don't want to have self-regulation. They want to pursue medical regulation. But this issue goes deeper. I mean, anyone with hospital privileges can't speak out unless you get clearance from your hospital communications committee, because you want to make sure that you don't embarrass not only the hospital, but more specifically the Minister of Health in your province. I was silly enough to write just a very short letter to a tiny little local newspaper when I was just out of practice, and it was George Smitherman was the Minister of Health at that time, and so I invited Mr. Smitherman to come down and see how busy our emergency department was, and because he was saying that all the good he was doing for the province, and I think probably in hindsight, appropriately so, got in big trouble. The CEO called me up, the chief of staff called me up, the chief of the Medical Staff Association called me up, because the Minister of Health had called our CEO the next morning and said, "Hey, what's the matter? Can't you solve your wait times in your own department?" So physicians simply cannot speak out. And maybe the panelists have noticed that I have been maybe less exercised in some of my comments than my two colleagues here, just because I have to think about this all the time. I try to emphasize the pain and suffering from lockdowns, but at no point have I denied the fact that people do die from COVID, and certainly are sick and vulnerable, can get very sick and die from this virus. I do think our response to it has been unreasonable and caused harm and suffering in and of itself. However, I never once said that all lockdowns are always dumb no matter what, because I think perhaps there is a role in a targeted situation and in a particular locality when the hospital resources are overwhelmed. So yeah, great point, Roy, and I apologize to the people listening if I haven't been as brave as you would want me to be.
Shawn said something very interesting there, though, that that we're told we have to listen to the doctors, we have to listen to the experts, but the doctors aren't free to talk, and that's quite a situation we find ourselves in right now.
Well, I'm free to tell you the party line. So, for example,
Right.
If we were talking about cholesterol, the party line is you must eat salad and do 1,000 sit-ups a day and get on a statin because we want to save your life. I would be on shakier ground to come out and say, well, you're such an active guy. Why don't we let your cholesterol run high? Because really, you don't fit any of the tests or models that we use to predict your likelihood of cardiac events. Well, now I'm on much shakier ground. It's far safer for me just to stick to the party line.
And it's been observed by many that there's almost an insurance liability component to the way chief medical officers talk about things. I mean, there's so many activities that the actual risk possibility is infinitesimally small that you will contract the virus in this setting or that setting. But of course, you know, well, not of course, but I guess, and from what you're saying, they don't want to say, you know, okay, yeah, it's safe to do this, because they'll be the one person who does go and get it in a serious way from that. So then they have to tell the rest of us that that we can't do it. That seems to be a bit of a situation they've boxed themselves into.
You're absolutely right. The doctors think in a very twisted fashion. So when we tell you to get your colonoscopy, we'll tell you you could bleed to death, you could have a hole in your bowel, you could get infection, and you could wear a bag that collects your stool for the rest of your life. But you should still get your colonoscopy. When really, if I was talking to my friend, I would say, get your stupid colonoscopy. It's going to save your life, right? And I wouldn't emphasize all these negative things. Now, I hope no one quotes me out of context for that. But you're exactly right. And that's why we're seeing this culture of healthcare, the way we think and behave, amplified to the front page of newspapers. And so that's why my plea is for some sanity, for some people to make sense of all this and to back away from the details and start contextualizing it in a broader sense. What sort of suffering are we causing this whole country, not just from the disease itself and our lack of response to it, but our regulatory response, our policy response, and the economic response? So great comments there.
Okay, well, we have 3 questions left and about 6 minutes. So I'm gonna do rapid fire questions here. So we're gonna hear from Scott, David, and Jay Ross, and we'll do it in that order. So Scott, and then David, and then Jay Ross. Please try to keep your comments, keep your question to a comment. Sorry, keep your comment minimal, ask a question, keep it short, and then we'll go through and try to rapid fire answer them all. So let's start with you, Scott.
Hi, thanks panel for a great discussion. I'm a professor of literature. I'm teaching next week, 1984, the week after A Brave New World. My question to the panelists is, either these men are prophets or there's something that was observable 70 odd years ago when they wrote their books about the role of government and the understanding of human nature and dehumanization. My question is the lockdowns and the way in which we've proceeded against this virus not related to our misunderstanding what human nature is, a loss of the sense of human nature, which I think is the consequence of a loss of Christian understandings of what a human being is, which is connected with Christian theology because of course God became man. But rather than me go on, the panelists' comments.
That's a great question, a great line of reasoning. Let's go to the next question, and then we'll get everyone to chime in on those topics. So we'll promote David up to the panel.
Okay, I'll make this pretty quick here. All I've noticed from the very beginning, and I don't know why I'm so unique opposed to everybody else I know, all the elements of this virus, the lockdowns, has happened in such a coordinated fashion. The attack on personal rights and freedoms from bureaucrats and politicians and doctors and media and more. And it's happened simultaneously across the whole world. And so each element of these things, if you really look into it, and I've tried to do that, the falsity of the PCR tests, never intended to be a diagnostic test, mandatory mask use, the vaccine not having been tested or even approved in the US by the FDA. And now there's talk of mandatory vaccines and health passports that do not prove health in any way. Do any of you have views on a possible greater agenda behind the virus and the vaccine? So is it profit? Is it power? Is it ideology or something else? Thanks.
It's also a very good question. Thank you so much, David. And we'll go to the final question, Jay Ross. If we could promote Jay Ross to a panelist, and you will have the floor to ask your question.
I think more egregious even than what the government has done is the attitude of Canadians. And when I tell you just a few things about myself, you'll see this. I have lost the sympathy of my friends in Toronto. You may be able to tell from my voice, I'm a dual citizen. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, And my permanent residence has been in Toronto for the past 60 years. I'm in my 80s, I'm retired now, and I'm talking to you from my home in Florida. I had hoped to be a returning snowbird. I did not know that the present situation would hit me. And I'm afraid to come back. I do not want to be imprisoned. I don't want to fear imprisonment. I become moderately claustrophobic just in thinking about it. I had hoped that John Carpay could offer me some hope, but I have doubts about that. And as for specific questions, is there, there's my revenge part, is there any penalty to the government if they lose anything from a court case? On the more positive side, will they actually have to change the rules if they lose anything? And from the realistic side, could this not take years before I can come home?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And sorry, I didn't catch your name. I just have J. Ross as your name there, but that's okay. All right, so we'll do a rapid fire answer. So I'll just quickly sum up the questions because I know we're running out of time here. But the first question was about predicting human nature in these books like 1984 and Strange New World, and whether the erosion of Christian values has something to do with that. The second question was about possible ulterior motives, or why so much of this is happening. Is there something else at play that we're not being told? And the final question, does the government actually have any responsibility? Will there be any consequences, and should we have any hope going forward? So let's answer in the same order that we did our opening remarks. So we'll go to you first, Shawn.
Okay.
Sure, great. I love questions from Scott. They're always easy to answer. Scott, you're asking if there's a change in the ontology of what it means to be human. I would say there's been a greater change in the ontology of government. And so another shout out. I love books, as you can tell. Why Liberalism Failed, Patrick Deneen, fantastic book. And I think we're seeing an end to liberalism, shall we say. And we're now starting to see government really for how to get things done, as opposed to really being in government for government's own sake. So representative democracy. So I would say that that's where the change lies, in the ontology of government and civil society, as opposed to the ontology of what it means to be a human. David asked, is there a greater agenda to the virus and vaccine? I don't think there is. However, I think there may be a greater agenda in our response to it. Certainly, that seems like we've heard comments from a number of senior leaders saying that this is an opportunity for a great reset. So I don't think anyone started the virus and the vaccine with ulterior motives, but certainly the response to it seems to be too good of an opportunity to let pass. And to Jay Ross from Florida, I'm very jealous that you're in Florida, so I'm glad that you're there. I would feel your same fear at returning. My relatives are in Florida as well. As to a penalty to government, I have no idea. I've yet to see politicians actually be held to account in Canada. The Prime Minister of Finland resigned after failing to meet his healthcare objectives that he promised while campaigning, whereas our current Prime Minister promised a family doctor for every citizen in Canada, and I haven't seen him fulfill that promise yet. So penalty to government, I would be surprised. Thanks.
Regarding Scott's question on human nature, one observation I keep on making is that all of these lockdown policies treat us as though we have no souls, as if we are merely clumps of cells whose sole purpose is to stay alive as long as possible. And there's this implicit dismissal of our mental health, our emotional health, our spiritual health. The way these policies are imposed and promoted, it's almost as though we are just kind of farm animals, and whatever mental or emotional or spiritual health, whatever psychological needs, doesn't matter, thrust into isolation and loneliness, suffering, stress, anxiety, depression. Well, too bad, suck it up. We just got to keep your body alive. So I think that's a very twisted ideology underlying the lockdowns. David's question, is there a greater agenda for profit, power, ideology? My answer would be probably yes, but it's not something we're going to argue in court. We don't need to. We're just looking at the lockdown harms versus potential benefits and the legal justification. That's it. We're not going to go further. But, you know, personally, I think there probably is something sinister at play. Again, not to be argued in court. And for Jay's question, my answers are mostly negative. We're, in terms of the timeline, yes, court actions do take years. What we're hopeful for is making an application for an interlocutory injunction, which would still take months, but not years. And so if we can get an injunction that pending this 3-year or 4-year court action, in the interim, we're not going to have the prison hotels. We're going to let people go back to letting people quarantine at home. So that would be the hope is to achieve an interlocutory or interim injunction. And penalty to government, sadly, no. Will they have to change the rules? Yes. If the Justice Centre wins in court, then that does have an impact, that governments get their hands tied in terms of what they can and cannot do in future. So.
A very profound question from Scott, and it just makes me think of how now more than ever, at least in decades, I don't know, since the Maoist period or what have you, is the individual more subsumed beneath the group. And that is so troubling and disturbing. And we're seeing it at play, and other people goaded on. To the question of agendas, I think Dr. Watley makes a good point that it didn't start that way, but people have seen crisis and opportunity. At the same time, I don't believe there's actually all that much organization going on, only because more what we're witnessing is institutional inertia. Shawn mentioned, I believe it was Shawn mentioning the managerial class. These are not leaders, whether they're leading us to good or to bad. These are followers. And I think we're kind of victims of that, just them tagging along with whatever memo they got, and they just happen to have received the memo from Wuhan, unfortunately. And that's sort of what normalized lockdowns, which previously these public health officials who are at the press conference saying we need to do the lockdowns, and some of them teach it at University of Toronto Public Health. 2 years ago, if one of their students had written a paper calling for what's happening right now, they would have failed that student, or at least, you know, given them a 51% or whatnot on it. I mean, this is not, they would not have considered it a serious idea before. To the lady in Florida, it pains me to say this, but as someone who lives in Toronto right now, I mean, I have spent some wistful time browsing through Florida real estate recently. I'm not a dual national, so it's useless what I've done, but one can dream. Toronto is the shithole of North America right now. I love my city, I love my country, but if I could be anywhere else right now, I would.
Well, Anthony, that seems like a very sad note to end the panel on, but
Sorry.
I guess it's, the whole topic is a little bit depressing. So thank you so much to all three of our panelists. I think it was a really interesting conversation and discussion, and hopefully it leads to a lot more dialogue and discussion about what can be done going forward. So thank you so much to the panelists, to the audience. Thank you so much, and we hope you have enjoyed our event tonight.